Hello and welcome back to awtoolbox.com. My name's Glenn Keller, and what we're doing in this video is kind of expanding on our installation knowledge. So far, we have been able to work through installation using Deployment Center in a single box environment. We went through a 2412 installation doing that, and then we, after 2506 came out, did an upgrade in place to 2506. So in this case, we're going to have to build out some additional things. So we're going to do a bunch in the next series of videos or releases. In this video, what we're going to be focusing on is, now that we have 2506 here and available to us, what do we need to do next to get it available to our clients? Or what options do we have to do things like deployments to 300 different Windows operating systems? What kind of tools can I use in the system? So in this video, we are specifically talking about what's called the Mass Client Update. This is a really cool tool with Deployment Center. In the rich client, you used to have a configuration file in which that had all the features and everything that you would need, and then you could run that. In Deployment Center, you have what's called a Mass Client Update. This is specific for things like deploying the rich clients out. Obviously, Active Workspace comes with the Active Workspace client installation. So what we're going to do in this video is we have a couple of things. So I've got this Teamcenter environment here that we're going to be working with, and I need to do a couple of things to enable a Mass Client deploy. The first one is I'm going to go to my options, and I'm going to just make sure that my environment is set to a distributed environment. Now, in the options panel that just opened, you can see that there are several different types of architecture selections, environment types, infrastructure types, and additional options down below. If we are working in this scenario where we have a single environment, it's deployed on one machine, then the single box option is most likely selected, and that's our selection. That's what we have right here. All the other options, like this one, is for your web tier architecture. So this one up here, whether you're deployed as a WAR file or .zip to IIS or to like JBoss, Tomcat, WebLogic, one of those Java EE web application servers. And that was selected at the initial installation or the upgrade. The infrastructure type is a little bit more. So basically this will let you communicate between environments. Get into more of a multi-site kind of environment where you have cross-compatibility or access between Teamcenter sites. For this use case, we're going to distributed. So you can switch between these. I'm just going to go ahead and pick the distributed option right there. And then I'm going to save the environment options. So once I do this, then I can see that the status switches to pending updates. And it's going to move on to my application screen here in a second. So once it opens up, we'll be able to see all of the pending edits that are going to take place. The other thing that it allows us to do is once we get to components, we'll be able to fill out multiple different options. So like Mass Client deploys, we'll have different places we can put things. If you wanted to do an install where you had the visualization components in a separate directory than the main TC root, you would have to pick distributed as well. You can see that my applications, these are just my server extensions, so they haven't really changed much. But when I go to components, you're going to see a little bit of a tweak. So inside of components, once it loads, we'll take a deeper dive into the settings here. And I can select something like Active Workspace Client Builder. And I've went from a single box to a distributed box, but I can't change the machine name here or the root directory. And that's because it's already installed. So I'd have to remove that component. But if I come down, I just want to make sure that the 100% are here. So all of this column needs to be 100%. Sometimes it will make tweaks to you. So everything is good. I'm also going to take a note that I already have a 2-tier rich client deployed. I know that I have that because of the shortcut over here, and we tested it at the end of the last segment of videos. So I have the 2-tier on this server, but again, the goal here is not to deploy on this server. The goal is I have my Teamcenter resources back here. So Teamcenter, this could be the database, it could be the pool server, it could be the FSC. All of the stuff that make up Teamcenter is behind this wall. That could be multiple servers, but it's over here. The goal here is to have a client machine sitting over here and be able to deploy and communicate back and forth. And then if you zoom out a little bit, maybe this area over here is actually in Alaska. And then maybe this area over here is sitting somewhere in California. So in this case, we have to be able to communicate at distance between the client and the server. And though there are ways to optimize this communication, the key component to this is HTTPS or HTTP. So we'll just put it like that. So the communication needs to be an HTTP request, not anything else. So whenever I see HTTP involved, then we know that we're in a 4-tier architecture. Typically, we only have the 2 tiers installed directly on the server or in a LAN with instant access to the server. So this is going to be a 4-tier rich client that I want to install. So we'll come back into here, and I'm going to just go ahead and click this little plus button right up at the top here. It's going to load up some additional options that I can install. Just think of it as additional configurations. So I can install like an additional gateway for load balancing or failover. I could install more BMIDEs, just additional modules, things like dispatcher or an additional FSC to allow for like file caching over at that other location to increase file performance. There's a lot of things in here, but for this use case, we're going to stick to the 4-tier rich client as our example. I'm going to select that and choose Update Selected Components, just right down here at the bottom. Once it loads up, I'm going to look at it and make sure that everything is filled out. Remember, the goal of this client is to basically take this deployment and then execute it on a whole bunch of machines. Maybe schedule it to push, that kind of thing. So if I scroll down now that it's reloaded, then I can see right next to the 2-tier, which is here, I have the 4-tier, and I do need to start that. So I'm going to go ahead and click this. I'm going to full screen the screen just so we have a little bit more real estate. And then once it opens up, what we're going to be doing is just kind of checking everything. So in here, you can see that we have, do you want to import rich client 4-tier from other environments? So if you had another environment and you selected this, then it's going to ask you what environment to pick from. And if you've already built out a rich client build, you can just import it from the other environment in this system. And if it's not even in this deployment center build, you can export it from the other one and import it in. So I don't want to do that in this case. I'm going to uncheck that. The environment infrastructure type has been inherited from my build. So it is going to be local in my case. And then the client settings, the one thing is if I want to install this here, like right on this box in that TC root that I have already installed everything else on, I already have a 2-tier rich client installed in that location. So you can't really have 2 rich clients installed in the same directory. So I wouldn't be able to do that. But if I wanted to, I would not check Enable Mass Client Deploy. I don't have any necessary reason to change the host name of where it's going to get deployed or the directories or make it any different. So in that case, I'm not going to check this. But in our case, we need to deploy this out to hundreds of users. So I'm just going to go ahead and check Enable Mass Client Deploy. And then if you notice down below here, there's other options. So I'm just going to check that checkbox. And then notice this changes. So from the machine name to the mass client instance name. So there are other options depending on whether or not you deploy this. So I'm going to go ahead and do mass client. So I want this to deploy out to a lot of users. The instance name is going to be my TC underscore 2506 4T rack. So I want it to be that, and I'm going to make this uppercase as well. And then the OS that I'm deploying on, typically I'm going to be deploying on Windows. The reason for Windows deployments is most of my users are using Windows. Now, if I have the need to deploy a 2-tier rich client or a 4-tier rich client onto all of my servers so that we can kind of use those as a backup way to access the environment, then those servers may be Linux based, and I would have to choose the LNX64 option. But in our case, I don't need to do that. In the general settings, the installation, this is going to be the installation path of wherever you want to install it. So when you take it over to that client machine, this is where it's going to get installed. I'm going to go ahead and keep that. That's the base one. But I will say that if you are deploying for, let's say, an administrative group, sometimes you will either have 4 different rich clients for specific reasons. And in those cases, it may be advantageous to change the name up a little bit. And then the other thing is this Teamcenter 2312 string is still getting picked up in here. We saw this in 2412 as well. So I'm just going to remove this and put 2506. And that's Teamcenter root. And if I install other clients in the future on these boxes, then I'll just have to make note that I have to have a variation on that TC root. So maybe I keep Teamcenter root as the production, and then I add an underscore dev, test, whatever. So in here, I've got this put into the directory. I am going to keep the space in that program files just because that's a common place for things to get installed. We'll see what happens with that. Typically, we try and avoid spaces, put it in C apps or something along those lines. And then notice it's got some additional applications in the supported list, so product configurator. And I'm just going to, in my case, I'm limited on licensing, so I'm just going to uncheck those. And I'm going to say save component settings. So at this point, I should have a 100% on the rich client, the 4-tier. So you'll see that load up here in a second, and then I can generate the build. And then we'll take a look at the build. We'll see kind of how it's a little bit different, how it's the same. You can see it already looks a little different here in the interface. So because it's a mass client deploy, it's got the ID of this object, and then you've got the status, what type of operating system, deployment center with anything that's deployed in a distributed environment. In that case, deployment center isn't going to be able to check on the status. It's not going to interact with that other component. So in this case, for the mass client deploy, it's not going to talk back and see if that installed. It wouldn't be proper for that. So it's just going to leave an NA for that status check. And then if I scroll to the right here, it's just got the root. So I can double check those features before I even have to open it up. That's really nice. And then just note that there is an eyeball up here, and this eyeball does not appear to be checked by default. And if I come down, general settings, you can see that it's got the 2506 Teamcenter root, but notice it also allows me to specify a different runtime folder, so a runtime temporary folder. If you needed to, ctemp, something along those lines. It'll pick a default one if you don't. And then a new installation of TCCS. This is a Teamcenter client communication system. It's part of the mechanism that moves files around the system called FMS. Essentially, this will house your file client cache. and I don't have one on these computers that I'm deploying out to already, so I'm going to install a new one. For those administrators that are going to deploy these out to the systems, just know if you had a previous version, it's probably more recommended to just remove that version and then install the new version for cleanliness. You can upgrade a rich client, but then there's a lot of files and things that get muddied up with that, where you have to track through which patches and stuff have been applied. So I just recommend, if you're doing these mass clients, to just delete it and then install the new one if you need to override it. Compress the web application server response. This is just going to minimize the amount of data transferring over your network. And then you have the 4-tier connection string. You can override that if it doesn't match yours. So this is just being inherited down from another component. And then you can add the applications again. You could also enable the online help. So in here, I would like to go ahead and give it my help server. So I'm going to come up to the top here and go to my Siemens doc server. We had done a 2506 demo on updating the online help. And then I'm just going to grab this because I want it to take it to the home for 2506, not the home for the landing page of all help. And then I'll come back into Deployment Center, which is in that browser, but on a different tab. And I'll paste that in the documentation server. I'm going to go ahead and save component settings. And at this point, I should be at a pretty good level. Notice there is also, while we wait, a Teamcenter client communication system mass client deployment down here because I chose to add that TCCS. And not just connect to an existing one. So I've got 2 components that'll be chalked up inside of that script when we generate it. The rest of the components have not changed, but I'm just going to go ahead and say go to deploy. And then it should give me the ability to generate the deploy scripts. So I'll say generate install scripts. And then we'll look at the output from this, and then we'll go through the motions of actually performing the installation, and we'll validate that that client was not here beforehand and that it is there after the fact. So in this case, just know it's your general deployment instructions, what's going to be installed, what's going to be needed, where the deployment script got generated. And then you can see there's the 4-tier rack deployment communication system, so it's got its own name. I'm just going to go ahead and grab this and put it in my clipboard, so I'm going to copy it. And then you can notice that it took a snapshot of Deployment Center's environment for you. And that way you have kind of a save state before it did it. And then the deploy instructions for the machine scripts, as well as the mass client deploy scripts. So I'm just going to go ahead and come out of here. I'm going to go into my environment, and I'm going to paste that path where it generated my deploy. In this case, there's my mass client deploy. If I open the instructions, it's going to be the same instructions that we saw before. But if we zoom in on what steps we need to do, which are these right here, the first one is basically just telling you the purpose of the mass deploy. So you can take it and deploy it to hundreds of clients. The second one, if I come down here, is when you run it, it doesn't need a status information to check with Deployment Center. So we talked about this a little bit more. That means it's not going to talk back and forth. And it's going to allow you to execute this, but you need to check on it and test it. And then the mass deploy script automatically determined whether to perform the new installation or an update. So what's cool is if I need to make a change, I don't need to flag anything. It's just going to basically let it know that this is only an update or this is a fresh deployment. So now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and minimize the system, and I'm going to go ahead and extract this. So I'm going to say extract all, extract. It's a fairly small little package here. Only takes a couple of minutes with the built-in extract system if you can't use something like 7-zip. And then inside of the deploy mass client, you can see that I have the full directory here, very similar to what we're used to seeing with deploying like the full environment. I have my deploy script. I need to basically get to this directory in a command prompt. I'm going to open up a command prompt. This does not need to be a Teamcenter command prompt. You don't have Teamcenter on the machine that you're going to deploy to. So if I'm going to deploy on that machine, I need a command prompt. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to cd, just a trick. If you do a /D, if you're on another drive, you don't have to then follow up with a different drive letter. I don't have that issue, but just a trick. So now I'm in here and notice the length of this path. So I'm in Windows. I know that this is going to extract other files as a part of the process. I know that it's going to nest other directories. I really recommend taking this entire directory and cutting it or copying it over to the ctemp directory. So I've done this in other videos. I highly recommend it because that's going to shorten that path. Right now, it's going to yell at me because I'm in that directory. So I'll just cd up one. And then I can go forward and say try again. And it'll let me do that. So in here, I now have a shorter path. And I can cd to that. And that's just going to save you from any file length issues in Windows. So I'm going to CLS to clear the screen. And then I'm going to go ahead and run the deploy. And if you just do a -H, just right off the get-go, you'll have an on-screen help. And I like this one because not only does it define everything, but right here is the sample usage. And I don't even need to remember the full syntax of what I want. So notice there's the DC username and password. If you deployed Deployment Center with a password file, then that's how you call it out. You can define the software location, the kits as well, and then you could say also do the diagnostic checks, the software location, and ignore diagnostics. If you don't run the diagnostics, then you may get into issues with like pre-checks or prereqs weren't installed. I'm just going to go ahead and say deploy.bat -dc username equals, and I'm going to give it mine, which is dc admin. DC password equals DC admin. And then at this point, I'm going to go through and say dash software location. And I'm going to point to my Siemens software media directory. So in here, you can see my media is in here. There's Siemens, there's software, and that's where all my media lives. So I'm going to copy that. And I'll just paste it. And then if I press enter now, it's going to attempt to do the deploy if I have this correct. So in this case, it's going through. It's beginning the deployment. It's validating the Java version. It's going through and deploying the certs or checking to see if I do need it and adding it to it. In here, we've got basically a whole bunch of validation, and it's going in and scanning the software applications and components, and this is kind of how it detects whether or not an update is being applied or a new installation is needed. It's going to check that installation directory. We chose to keep it in this program files Siemens folder, and notice I don't have a Teamcenter 2506 yet, but at the completion of this, it's going to go in and it's going to start building out the Teamcenter root directory. And you'll see that the folders will actually start getting created here as soon as this process gets done. There it goes. So right after that finished, you got the Teamcenter 2506 directory and the TC root. So in here, you can see a lot of different files and folders getting deployed. This is my TCCS, so that's my file client cache. If I go into the environment variables on the box, then I can see that FMS home has been changed to the new FMS, and that will change my existing Teamcenter environment to not be able to work. My Java homes have been set. That's good. And then just take note that check your system variables, make sure they're all set in there so that other users on the same machine can take advantage. But it is good so you don't have to do a restart if you just set them in your user environment variables for the time being. All right, so I'll hit cancel here. This is getting through. You can see 31 of 33. Just note that if I go back during this deployment at any time, you can dive into the directory that we kicked the deployment off at, and there are a set of logs in here. The logs have both the internal deployment center logs as well as the deployer log. And this one is actually fairly helpful. When you open it up, it is going to give you that full output that we're used to using the TIM interface. So you'll see a lot of information that we typically see in that TIM interface, but it'll have pretty good breakdowns. This is your guide for the troubleshooting of the deployment center installation. Don't forget that deployer in the logs directory underneath that build. And then inside of the internal, you can see table builder, task tracer. If you just open any of these just to give you some awareness, it's going to give you a little bit more information. So if you do get an error and you're stuck, I do recommend looking. But a lot of this is going to be just, can it add the variable? Can it create it in the system? And if you see errors in here, it's probably related to something along the lines of permission or network. It's almost done. We're at step 31 of 33 now. The other thing that you should concern yourself with, because I did this all on one box, I get a little bit of an issue in here. I may get links that open up to older destinations. So 2506, and I can tell you this one is, if I open file location, this one's pointing to the Siemens in the program files location. So yeah, it has updated my shortcut here, and I'll need to remember that because I also have a 2-tier client on this box. But don't worry, we will end up removing one of the two just as kind of an additional demo. Let's go ahead and give it a moment to finish here. We'll come back and we'll finish it up by testing it out and making sure everything is good on the machine. And we will finish this off, and then we'll move into topics like how do we remove the clients once they are at it. All right, so it has begun to move a little bit here. We're at step 33 of 33. We're sitting at roughly 3 to 5 minutes on the execution so far for the deployment of this rich client. In here, we've taken note that there are little things like the shortcut getting overridden, the menu option in the start got overridden as well, that we may have to clean up to ensure that we have a successful build and that our users are not confused if they had older versions or other versions of the software on the client. Notice that this is now successful. That's awesome. So deploy script execution successful. So I can go ahead and close this command prompt now. I've got my logs and everything for the deploy here, so this may be good to back up or diagnose if there's any errors going forward, but I'm pretty much done with that directory. And then I can be assured that if I hover over this, it says C program files, so that's my new 4-tier rich client. I'm going to launch it. And I still have all my services up. One thing you'll note is I didn't take any services down during the process, and my active workspace window is still here. So as soon as I find it, I can still interact with my active workspace window and open things up and do different things in there. So didn't bring down the site because this is a deploy on a different machine theoretically. And then in the rich client, I'm going to come in, log in. You can choose whatever user. Teamcenter training is the environment I'm deploying from. And then I'm going to hit log in. So at this point, we know that this is running from the program files directory. We know that the deploy went well. and we are just attempting a login to test out the client. I highly recommend doing a couple of simple tests in the client to ensure that the deployment went well. For a rich client, one of the underlying features is that FMS component, the TCCS. So I want to go in here and upload a file and download a file just to ensure that my FMS system is working. I'm going to right click and choose named references, and then I'm going to choose the named reference in here and choose download. At that point, if I download it and it downloads successfully, then my FMS system is working. If you don't have a file, you can search for the type of Excel. There's a lot of different template files that are Excel based in the system, and use one of those as an example. If I come into downloads, you can see that I have the new file right here somewhere. It's probably under my users. So if I go to InfoDBA, downloads, it is not in there. So let's change the directory real quick. Just make sure we're in the right spot. Oh, it went to documents. That's where it's at. So in here, go to documents. You can see spec is here. If I want to do it again, let's download again. Documents, download, and now I get an override statement. So it is definitely working. If you utilize this for visualization components, go check that, make sure it's working. But all in all, the mass client deployment has succeeded. Then I can close this, choose yes, and you have completed that mass client deployment.